She had perfected the art of disappearing inside a crowded room. Every morning without fail, she arrived before the other staff, before the cooks began their preparations, before the gardeners pulled on their gloves, before the security team changed shifts at the iron gate. She arrived in the quiet hour, when the mansion held its breath, when the only sound was the distant hum of the city beyond the stone walls. She liked it that way. Silence asked nothing of her. Silence didn't stare. Her name was on the employee roster. It had been there for nearly 3 years. But in a household staffed by dozens, she moved through the grand corridors like a shadow that had learned to behave present when needed, invisible when possible, apologizing whenever someone thanked her, as though gratitude itself made her uncomfortable. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet physical strength that came not from the gym but from years of lifting, carrying, and enduring. Her uniform was always pressed. Her dark hair was always neatly pinned. Her smile, that small, careful, controlled expression she wore like armor, was always in place. That morning, she wore long sleeves. She always wore long sleeves. Even in summer, even when the kitchen grew so warm that the younger maids complained and rolled their cuffs to the elbow, she kept hers buttoned to the wrist. Nobody asked why. People rarely asked the questions that mattered most. The grand dining hall stretched the entire east wing of the mansion, its floors laid with pale Italian marble, its ceilings high enough to carry every sound: the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the careful footsteps of staff upward and across the room, in a way that made every noise feel slightly larger than it was. Long windows flooded the space with morning light. The chandeliers above were off. They were only lit in the evenings when the boss entertained guests. She moved through it with the practiced ease of someone who had learned exactly how to carry a tray without drawing attention. Head tilted just slightly downward, eyes tracking the floor's surface just far enough ahead to navigate without looking up. Shoulders curved inward, not with poor posture but with deliberate smallness. She had learned long ago that the less space a person occupied, the less likely they were to be noticed. And the less noticed she was, the safer everything became. The kitchen was only 30 meters away. She was going to make it. She almost did. The ruthless Mafia boss was not a man who missed things. That reputation had not been earned through carelessness. At 52, he had spent 3 decades building an empire through a combination of intelligence, patience, and an almost predatory awareness of his surroundings. He noticed everything the way a business associate's left eye twitched before a lie, the slight hesitation in a subordinate's voice before bad news, the fraction of a second delay before someone answered a question they should have answered immediately. He noticed the maid, not because she moved wrongly. She moved perfectly, better than perfectly, in fact. She moved the way people move when they have spent enormous energy learning not to be seen. And that precision, that studied invisibility, was itself the thing that caught his eye. He looked up from his coffee. His gaze traveled from her carefully lowered head down the length of her uniform, and then upward again to her face. For a moment, he saw only the familiar, careful smile beginning to form. Then the morning light shifted through the tall windows and fell across her cheek, and the deep purple bruise bloomed in full clarity beneath that light, wide and dark and unmistakable. The porcelain cup slipped from his hand. It struck the marble floor and shattered across it in a cascade of sound that rang through every corner of the dining hall. Every person in the room froze. The 2 security men standing by the door straightened instantly. The junior maid polishing silver at the sideboard went completely still. The elderly butler, standing near the service entrance with his hands clasped behind his back, turned his head with an expression that was not alarm but something quieter, a recognition, perhaps, that whatever followed would not be ordinary. He rose from his chair so swiftly that it overturned behind him with a crash that echoed off the marble. He did not look at the chair. His eyes did not leave her face. "Bring her to me." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. His voice in its quiet register carried more authority than another man's shout. Every syllable landed with the weight of someone who had never had to repeat a command twice. She stopped walking. She did not turn around. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the serving tray until they trembled, and she stood perfectly still for several seconds, as though if she stayed motionless long enough, the moment might simply resolve itself, without requiring her participation. When she finally turned, her eyes were already wet. "Please," The word was barely a sound. It fell from her lips like something she had not meant to release. Please don't make this worse. He didn't answer. He simply looked at her, at the bruise, at the careful way she held herself, at the trembling hands gripping the tray. And for the first time in a very long while, every person watching him saw something on his face that none of them would have thought possible in a man of his history and reputation. Not the cold, measured fury he displayed during a hostile negotiation. Not the controlled aggression that preceded consequences for those who crossed him. Something raw, something that looked extraordinarily like a man who had just discovered that something wrong had been allowed to happen under his own roof, and who had not yet decided what to do with that knowledge. The private library occupied the interior of the mansion's north wing, a room built not for display, but for genuine use. Its walls rose 2 stories and were lined floor to ceiling with books, tens of thousands of them, organized with the quiet precision of a man who actually read what he owned. The furniture was old and heavy, dark leather chairs, an oak desk broad enough to serve as a conference table, lamps that cast warm amber light even in the full brightness of morning. The room smelled of cedarwood and old paper, and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco from decades past. It smelled nothing like danger, and yet her hands would not stop shaking as she followed him inside. The heavy oak doors closed behind them. A moment later, the sound of the dining hall, the resumed murmur of conversation, the careful resumption of ordinary tasks became inaudible, as though the room had swallowed the outside world whole. He gestured toward the armchair nearest the window. "Sit." She hesitated. Then slowly, carefully, she lowered herself into the chair, as though she expected to be corrected for it. She set the tray aside on a small table and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor. He did not sit. He walked instead to a cabinet near the far wall and opened it without searching the action of a man who knew exactly where everything in his possession was kept, and retrieved a first aid kit. He placed it on the low table between them and stepped back. "Treat your wounds." She looked at the box. Then, at him. "I'll be fine." "No." His voice was not unkind. It was simply certain in the way that certain men are certain not as cruelty, but as fact. "You won't." She stared at the first aid kit for a long moment. Then she pulled it toward herself and opened it slowly, selecting an antiseptic wipe with the careful deliberateness of someone who had done this before. Many times before. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that accumulates meaning, that says more in its absence than most conversations manage with words. He waited until she had finished before he spoke again. "I have been informed," he said quietly, sitting now in the chair across from her, "that you have worked in this household for nearly 3 years. Yes. In that time, have you ever caused trouble?" "No," she answered immediately. "Never." "I know." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. "You have nothing to fear regarding your position here. You will not lose this job." The certainty in his voice caught her off guard. She looked up at him briefly, a quick, involuntary glance, then back down. "This isn't your concern," she said softly. "It became my concern the moment you walked into my house, covered in bruises." She said nothing. The muscle in her jaw tightened. He did not press her immediately. He let the silence hold for another long moment before asking the question that had been sitting in the room since the moment the library doors had closed. "Who did this to you?" She closed her eyes. For a brief, suspended moment, the room felt like a place where the truth might actually emerge, might rise to the surface, like something submerged, finally floating free. He saw it on her face. The calculation, the consideration, the almost. Then she whispered the same small lie she had clearly whispered many times before. So many times it no longer required effort. He fell. He did not argue. He did not call her a liar. He simply reached forward, very slowly, and lifted the sleeve of her uniform a few centimeters above her wrist. He looked at what was there. Dark fingerprints, 4 on one side, 1 large thumb impression on the other, circled her wrist in a pattern that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. Someone had not struck her in a fall. Someone had wrapped their hand around her wrist and held her in place while she tried to pull away. He let the fabric fall back. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. quieter in the way that things become quiet when they are held under great pressure. "Look at me." Slowly. She did. "What are you protecting?" A single tear broke from the corner of her eye and traveled down the curve of her cheek, following the outer edge of the bruise. She did not answer, but in that silence, he understood something with sudden and absolute clarity. She was not protecting herself. A person protecting themselves avoids the truth to protect their own safety, their own future. What he saw on her face was something entirely different. She was protecting someone else. "If I tell you—" She stopped. Her breath caught. She tried again. "If I tell you, someone dies." The words fell into the room and settled there, quiet and immovable as stones. The library door closed behind her when she left. He remained exactly where he was, for a long while seated. Still, his eyes on the empty chair she had occupied, turning her words over in his mind, like a man who has received new information and is not yet sure of its full dimensions. Then he turned to the elderly butler, who stood waiting at the threshold with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to receiving unusual instructions without comment. "Find out who she is afraid of." The butler nodded once. "No assumptions," he added. "I want facts." "It will be done." By lunchtime, whispers had begun their circuit through the mansion, with the quiet velocity of a current moving beneath still water. Some of the staff believed she had an abusive boyfriend, a man who drank too much, perhaps, or owed money to the wrong people, and took his failures out on those nearest to him. Others thought she was caught in some form of debt that had escalated beyond reason. A few, the optimists, or perhaps merely the incurious, insisted she had fallen, as she had said, and that everyone was simply overreacting to what was ultimately a private matter. She said nothing to confirm or deny any of it. She returned to work. She served lunch. She cleared tables. She polished silver. She apologized when the young housemaid thanked her for holding a door open. She smiled the same small, careful smile at everyone who looked at her, and that smile did its work. It answered every unspoken question with a sufficiency that discouraged further inquiry. But the bruise on her cheek remained, and the long sleeves stayed buttoned, and the boss watched from the second-floor balcony as she moved through the afternoon with that studied, graceful invisibility, and he saw something that perhaps no one else was positioned to see. Every smile she gave was identical, not the natural small variations of a person who was genuinely responding to different moments in different ways. The same smile, precisely calibrated, offered to every person and every situation with the same controlled output. It was the smile of someone who had learned to perform normalcy so completely that the performance had become indistinguishable from the thing it imitated. That evening, the head of security arrived at the library with a thin folder. Employment records, background checks, references from 2 previous households, 3 years of performance evaluations, all positive, no disciplinary reports, no complaints filed against her, no criminal history, no outstanding debt visible in any accessible financial record. A woman, the file suggested, of unremarkable and ordinary life. Or, and this was the thought that kept the boss awake later that night, a woman who had become extraordinarily skilled at hiding the parts of her life that were anything but ordinary. The following morning brought another report. Neighbors from her apartment building a mid-range block in the older part of the city. Nothing remarkable described her consistently. Quiet. Left early. Returned late. Never invited visitors. Never caused trouble. Kept to herself in a way that read not as unfriendly but as deliberate as the choice of someone who had decided long ago that the safest distance between themselves and the rest of the world was a managed one. One neighbor, an elderly woman in the apartment directly below, mentioned something that did not fit the pattern. She had heard loud arguments through the ceiling not occasionally, but regularly, sometimes late into the night, shouting, things breaking, crying that she assumed belonged to a woman but could never be certain. And yet, in all the years this neighbor had lived below, she had never once seen another person enter or leave that apartment alongside its occupant. The butler brought this detail to the boss with his morning coffee, adding quietly before leaving the room, "There is one further thing." The boss looked up. "She refuses every paid vacation offered to her. She has never requested a raise. She has never borrowed an advance on her salary." The old man paused. "And every month, within hours of her salary being deposited, almost the entirety of it disappears. Transferred somewhere." The boss set his cup down. "To whom?" "We don't yet know." The phone call happened by chance. He was passing through the staff corridor near the east entrance, late one evening, when he heard her voice through the half-open door, soft, deliberately low, the voice of a person accustomed to making themselves small, even inside a private phone call. He caught only fragments, carried on the still air of the corridor. "I'm fine. No, don't tell anyone. I'll send it tomorrow. It's okay. I promise." What struck him was not the words themselves, but the tone beneath them. She was comforting someone, reassuring someone. Her voice carried that particular gentleness that surfaces in a person when they are speaking to someone they are afraid for, not someone they are afraid of. She noticed him in the doorway. The call ended immediately. She slipped the phone into her apron pocket and produced the familiar, careful smile with the speed of someone who had rehearsed the transition. "I'm sorry. I'll get back to work." He simply nodded and let her go. Not yet. 2 days later, the head of security returned. The folder he carried was notably thicker than the first. His expression, usually contained and professional, carried something new, a slight tension at the jaw, a hesitation before speaking that the boss had learned over the years to read as genuine unease. "We expanded the search," the man said, taking a slow breath. "Local hospitals. No recent emergency reports filed under her name." He slid a sheet across the desk. "Police databases. No complaints filed. No restraining orders. No statements given." Another sheet. "Court records. Nothing." The boss frowned. "People don't receive bruises like those from nothing." "No." The head of security reached into the folder. "So we looked elsewhere." He placed a financial summary on the desk. The monthly transfers. Same account. Same amount. Every month for nearly 5 years. The boss studied the record. "Who owns the account?" "We were waiting for confirmation." The security chief straightened slightly. "The answer came this morning." He placed a sealed envelope on the desk and said nothing further. The envelope remained unopened for several minutes. The boss regarded it with the deliberateness of a man who understood that some information, once received, cannot be unreceived, and that he was about to cross a threshold from which no version of polite unknowing was possible. He broke the seal. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a bank record. The monthly transfers, stretching back nearly 5 years, all directed to the same recipient. Not a boyfriend, not a husband, not a partner of any kind. A savings account, registered to a minor, a teenage girl, a younger sister. He looked up. She wasn't sending money to whoever was hurting her. The head of security shook his head slowly. She was supporting someone entirely different, someone who depended on her. The room was very quiet. "There is something else," the security chief said. The second folder, the thicker one, contained hospital records, not recent ones, old ones. A long chain of them, reaching back across more than a decade, each entry a small, clinical document describing an injury and an explanation that failed to account for it. Emergency room, dislocated shoulder, no police report, no follow-up, 2 cracked ribs. Patient refused referral to support services. Severe concussion, requested immediate discharge against medical advice. Burn injuries across the forearm, no statement given. Hairline fracture of the left wrist, cause documented as accidental. He turned pages. Each one revealed another injury, another visit, another silence. Each record carried the same quiet subtext, the gap between what was documented and what had actually occurred, and together they formed a portrait that was not ambiguous in any of its meanings. "How long?" he asked. "The earliest record we found was 12 years ago." 12 years. He set the folder down. The third document was a typed statement from a hospital nurse, a woman who had worked emergency admissions for many years and remembered patients the way certain people remember faces. Not always with full recall, but with the persistent sense of having looked at a particular truth and then been required to let it walk out the door. The nurse described a young woman who had arrived in the early hours of a winter morning, bleeding from a head wound, with a story about falling down stairs that she repeated with the mechanical precision of someone reciting from a script they had memorized under duress. The nursing staff had not believed the story. There was nothing in her presentation to support it. Before the young woman had left, the nurse had managed a brief moment alone with her. She had asked, directly and quietly, whether someone at home was hurting her. The young woman had looked at the window for a long time. Then she had said, "If I stay here, my sister will be alone with him." The boss set the paper down and did not pick up anything else for a long moment. He had expected cruelty when he opened that envelope. He had been prepared for cruelty. Cruelty was something he understood, something whose logic he could follow. He had not expected sacrifice. He had not expected a woman who had spent 12 years placing herself between a monster and a child. She walked into the library and saw the folders immediately. She had the kind of stillness that overtakes a person when they recognize, in a single moment, that something they have spent years carefully managing has moved beyond their control. Every color left her face. She stood in the doorway and looked at the spread of documents on the desk, the hospital records, the financial records, the typed statements, and something behind her eyes shifted from careful to resigned. "You investigated me." He met her gaze. "I investigated the lies." She did not flinch from this. She looked at the hospital records for a long moment, and something extraordinary happened. A faint smile crossed her lips, not the careful performance she wore for everyone else, but something smaller and more honest, a smile with defeat in it. The smile of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that the moment someone else finally acknowledges it produces not relief, but a strange, hollow recognition. "So you know." "I know enough to stop asking the wrong questions." He gestured toward the chair. She crossed the room and sat, and this time she sat the way a person sits when they are not pretending anymore, not with the precise minimalism of someone occupying as little space as possible, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone who has stopped calculating. "I don't deserve your kindness," she said. "You deserve the truth." Tears gathered in her eyes. She did not immediately brush them away. He waited, and then asked the question he had been saving. "How old were you?" She closed her eyes. 12. The word landed in the room with a weight completely disproportionate to its 2 syllables. "When it started?" She nodded. Her hands were folded in her lap, very still. "My mother died the year before. She remarried quickly. I think she thought it was the practical thing, the safe thing. A house, some stability, a breath. He seemed fine in the beginning. They always do." He said nothing. He simply listened. "When she died, he stayed. There wasn't a legal reason he had to, but he stayed." She opened her eyes and looked at the far bookshelf, not at him. "I was 13 by then. My sister was 4. He had understood already from the records, but hearing her say it aloud made the mathematics of it newly terrible. A 13-year-old girl, a 4-year-old child, and a man who had decided that both of them were now his to deal with however he chose. "It was easier when I was the one he was angry with," she said. Her voice was steady, not because she felt no emotion, he could see the emotion, but because she had spent so many years keeping her voice steady that it had become its own kind of reflex. If I could redirect his attention toward me, he left her alone. She was too small to understand what I was doing. She just thought I was clumsy, always falling, always getting hurt. She stopped, steadied herself. I kept thinking, if I could just work hard enough, send enough money, keep everything calm enough, maybe one day she'd be old enough to leave, to have a real life somewhere that he couldn't reach. He leaned forward. "Then leave. Take her with you." She looked at him with an expression that held no judgment, only the patient sadness of someone explaining something to a person who has lived safely enough that certain truths have never needed to be obvious to them. "If we disappear," she said quietly, "he finds us. He has before, twice. The second time, he put me in the hospital for 3 days. She paused, and even then, she begged me not to call the police, because he was still the only father she had ever known, because whatever he was to me, he was something different to her, even if that something was also wrong." He was silent. "Please," she said, and her voice, for the first time, carried a note of something close to pleading. "Don't hurt him." He stared at her. After everything he had read, after 12 years of hospital records, after a lifetime of evidence catalogued in thin manila folders and stamped with the clinical language of people who had suspected and documented and ultimately done nothing. After all of that, she was asking him not to hurt the man responsible. "My sister," she said. finishing the sentence before he could speak. Still needs someone, even if that someone is complicated. He had no answer. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he sat across from a situation and had nothing to offer in response to it. He simply nodded, very slowly, and let the silence hold what words could not. The library was dark by the time he gave the first instruction. He stood at the tall window, watching rain begin to fall on the stone courtyard, each drop leaving a small dark circle on the pale surface below, before the next arrived to obscure it. He thought about the nurse's statement. He thought about the 4-year-old child who had grown up believing that the woman being hurt in the next room was simply accident-prone. "Call the legal team," he said. The butler, standing at the threshold, inclined his head. And the forensic accountants. A pause. And the investigators. Full scope. If this man has spent 12 years hurting innocent people, he did not invent that habit with her. He will not have ended it with her. The butler withdrew without comment. What followed over the next 48 hours was not a confrontation. It was not violence. It was the quiet, methodical, devastating application of legitimate process, which is, he had always believed, the most durable form of consequence. Violence could be denied, could be retaliated against, could generate its own cycle of escalation. But evidence, carefully assembled and properly presented to the correct authorities, had a quality that violence lacked entirely. It was permanent. Financial records emerged first. Tax filings showing income that did not reconcile with declared employment. Insurance claims for property damage that investigators found, upon examination, had either not occurred or had been deliberately staged. Government assistance payments claimed for a household that had been quietly supplementing its income through unreported means for nearly a decade, and running through all of it a thread of smaller transactions, individually unremarkable, collectively forming a clear picture of a man who had learned to route money meant for others through his own hands. The monthly transfers, she had faithfully sent the money she had worked 12-hour days to earn, and had transferred within hours of receiving, had not been saved for her sister. They had been flowing quietly into accounts he controlled, converted into expenses she never saw, and benefits that never reached the girl they were supposedly supporting. He had not simply stolen her childhood, he had been stealing her future too, 1 month at a time, for years. "We don't touch him," the boss told his security chief, when the full picture had been assembled. "We expose him. If the evidence is clean, the evidence is clean. Let it speak." Prosecutors agreed to reopen multiple investigations. The hospital records established a documented history of suspected abuse, extending over more than a decade. Financial investigators confirmed years of systematic fraud across multiple categories. Former neighbors, learning that others had finally begun to speak, came forward one by one cautiously at first, then with more certainty as they understood that the silence they had maintained for so long was no longer the only available option. One woman described hearing sounds through shared walls that she had never reported because she had not believed anyone would act on the report. Another remembered a small girl sitting alone in a cold parking lot late on a winter night, crying and not knowing who to call. Everyone had suspected. No one had known the whole of it. Until now. The arrest took place just after dawn on a Tuesday. The boss did not need to be present, but he went. Not to watch. Not to derive any satisfaction from it. He arrived and stood at a distance, quietly, to ensure that the process faced no outside interference, that the weight of who he was did not accidentally tip a procedure that needed to remain clean and beyond reproach. 3 police vehicles stopped outside a small brick house on an unremarkable street. 2 detectives approached the front door. A warrant was presented. The shouting began before the door had fully opened. He denied everything. He accused everyone of lying. He told the detectives they were making a mistake. Then the officers began carrying boxes out of the house, computers, documents, bank statements, years of paper records, and each box that passed through the front door seemed to diminish the shouting by a degree, until by the time the last box had been loaded, there was nothing left to shout. Reality had arrived, and it was not interested in his version of events. At the estate, she sat in the library and twisted her hands in her lap and stared at the floor. She had known since the night before that it was happening. He had told her himself not as a courtesy, but because he believed she had the right to know what was being done, and the right to object if she chose. She had not objected. She had simply sat very still and said nothing for a long while, and then said, "I never wanted this." Now she sat in the quiet of the morning and waited. "You never caused this," he said, when he arrived back at the estate. She stopped, tried again. "He'll hate me. He made his choices a very long time before today. None of them were yours." The tears came silently. She did not try to contain them this time. She sat in the library where, months ago, she had worn long sleeves and told a careful lie about falling, and she wept for the first time, without checking to see whether anyone was watching. By afternoon, the charges had been formally announced: domestic abuse, insurance fraud, tax evasion, theft of public assistance, financial exploitation, and witness intimidation. The legal architecture assembled over the preceding days held. The evidence was, as promised, clean. As the transport vehicle prepared to leave, the man caught sight of the Mafia boss from across the street. His face twisted with a fury that had nowhere left to go. "You ruined my life." News cameras had gathered. People on the sidewalk had stopped. The words echoed in the still morning air with the quality of a final argument. The boss took one slow step forward. His expression did not change. "No," he said. His voice was quiet enough that the cameras would struggle to capture it, and yet every person nearby could hear it perfectly. "You ruined hers." A pause. "I simply made sure the world finally noticed." No one applauded. No one needed to. Justice, when it finally arrives after years of patience, speaks in a register that applause would only diminish. The vehicle door closed. A moment later, it rounded the corner and was gone. He stood on the sidewalk as the morning resumed around him, foot traffic resuming, conversations restarting, the ordinary texture of the city reasserting itself over the extraordinary thing that had just occurred, and felt something he could not immediately name. Not triumph. Not relief. Exactly. Something quieter. Something that had to do with 12 years, and a hospital nurse's statement, and a 4-year-old child who had grown up believing the violence in her home was ordinary. The rain had stopped. The stone of the sidewalk gleamed in the early light. 3 months is a short time and a long time, depending on what you are measuring. The mansion returned to its familiar rhythm. Breakfast at the usual hour. Fresh flowers in the hallway on Monday mornings. The staff, released from the careful tension that had held the household in a particular key since the morning of the shattered cup, began to laugh more easily, the way people laugh when a weight they had grown so accustomed to that they had stopped noticing it is finally lifted. Her bruises healed first. The swelling faded within 2 weeks. The purple became yellow, became the ordinary color of her skin. The other things took longer. The sleep, the kind of sleep that does not brace for sound, that does not hold some small portion of consciousness back from the edge of rest. Waiting took several weeks to find her. The reflex of minimizing herself, of automatically reducing the space she occupied and the sound she made, persisted longer still. These things do not simply cease because their cause has been removed. They have been practiced too many thousands of times for that. But they softened. Slowly, they softened. Her younger sister had been placed, with the assistance of a social worker assigned to the case, in a small and decent apartment of her own. She was enrolled in school, properly enrolled. Her attendance no longer contingent on circumstances beyond her control. For the first time in years, she slept in a space that belonged only to her, and did not carry the particular quality of air that belongs to rooms where fear has been the dominant atmosphere. Neither of them checked the lock twice before sleeping anymore. The boss had arranged everything. He never mentioned it. She discovered the truth only when the social worker, during a routine follow-up call, thanked her for the help of the person who had initiated the placement. "I've already thanked you," she said, confused. The social worker smiled. "You should thank the person actually responsible. He just prefers not to be." On an afternoon in early autumn, the butler found her in the entrance hall arranging the week's flowers, white roses, and late-season eucalyptus, filling the air with something clean and calm. "The boss would like to see you," he said. She looked up with the familiar, slight anxiety that still surfaced sometimes, reflexively, when she was summoned unexpectedly. "I haven't broken anything," she said. The old man smiled. "No. I believe today is rather the opposite." She found him in the estate garden. The afternoon light came through the rows of old oak trees in long, level shafts that turned everything slightly golden. The stone paths, the clipped hedges, the surface of the bench where he sat waiting. It was, she realized for the first time, a beautiful garden. She had worked in this house for years and had never once stopped to notice that. He stood when she approached and held out a small wooden box. "I believe this belongs to you." She took it with a small frown and opened it. Inside, on a thin velvet backing, was an employee name badge. She recognized it immediately, the weight of it, the slightly scuffed corner where it had caught on something in her early months here. She had thought it lost. "I thought," she began. "Open it properly." She looked more closely. The badge had been remade. Her name was the same. But beneath it, where the single word Maid had once appeared, the title had been changed. House manager. She stared at it. The garden sounds birdsong, the distant movement of the city beyond the walls, the soft percussion of leaves in a mild wind continued around her, indifferent to the particular significance of the moment. "I don't deserve this," she said. He shook his head. "No, you earned it." The tears came. But these were different from the ones that had fallen in the library, different from the ones that had fallen during a dozen hospital visits over the years, different from the silent ones that had traveled down her face in the morning of the arrest. Those tears had all carried some portion of grief in them. These were something else, something that had no practiced name but felt, in its unfamiliarity, like a first breath of a specific kind of air. The feeling of being seen. Not seen in the way the Bruises had been seen. Not as evidence. Not as a problem to be solved. But seen as a person. Seen for what she had chosen to be, in the spaces between the things that had happened to her. For the loyalty she had maintained across 3 years in this household without once being asked to maintain it. For the kindness she had extended to everyone around her despite having received very little of it in return. For the quiet, daily courage of a woman who had spent 12 years choosing her sister's safety over her own, without complaint, without recognition, without ever once making that choice visible. He had seen all of it. He looked out across the garden for a moment before speaking. "The morning I saw the Bruises," he said carefully, "my first thought was that I had failed, that I had allowed something to happen to someone under my protection without noticing." She started to shake her head, but he continued, "I know now that the failure didn't begin here. But if you'll allow me," he met her eyes, "I would like to ensure that nothing is ever added to what you've already carried." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she did something she had never once done in 3 years of working in this household. Something she had, in fact, not done with any person in recent memory, because trust, when it has been damaged as thoroughly and repeatedly as hers had been, does not easily find its way back to the simple physical grammar of safety. She stepped forward. She embraced him not with drama, not with the released emotion of a dam breaking, but quietly, the way a person embraces someone when they have finally decided, after a long period of deliberation, that this person can be trusted with their weight. He hesitated only a moment. Then he returned the embrace, not as a powerful man making a gesture, not as a benefactor confirming his own generosity, but simply as one human being holding another who had needed, for a very long time, to be held. Epilogue. Head high. The dining hall had not changed. Same pale marble floors. Same tall windows admitting the same morning light. Same chandeliers unlit in the daytime, as they always were. Same long table, same silver, same arrangement of carefully placed chairs. She walked through it every morning now with the name badge on her lapel, and she walked through it differently than she had walked through it on the morning everything changed. Not because the room was different, not because the people in it were different, but because she was different, and differently different, in a way that was more fundamental than simply having been rescued. She walked with her head level. Her shoulders were open rather than curved. She did not minimize the space she occupied. She did not clutch things against herself as a form of self-protection. She moved through a room the way a person moves when they have stopped trying to be invisible. The young staff sought her out with questions. The older staff called her by her new title, without irony or condescension. The butler, when he introduced her to new household members, described her in terms that had nothing to do with what had happened to her, only with who she was. She still passed the library door every morning. Every time, she paused for just a moment. Not out of sentiment exactly, more out of the habit of remembering because she had found, somewhat to her surprise, that the memory was not something she needed to protect herself from. The morning in the library had not been a rescue. She had not been saved. What had happened in that room was something both more modest and more significant than saving. Someone had looked at her for the full length of what she actually was and had refused to look away. She had spent so many years hoping to be invisible. She understood now that invisibility had never been the protection she had believed it to be. The protection, the real thing, durable and genuine, had been waiting in the simple, difficult act of being truly, completely seen. The scars were still there. Some would always be there, written into her body, in a language she had not chosen and could not translate away. She did not need them to disappear. They were part of her story, and her story, she had finally come to understand, was not a story of damage. It was a story of someone who had carried an impossible weight for an impossible length of time, and who had carried it not for herself, but for someone she loved, and who, when someone had finally offered to share that weight, had eventually, after a careful and reasonable period of deciding whether that offer could be trusted, accepted. She was not defined by what had been done to her. She was defined by what she had chosen to do in spite of it. And every morning she walked through the dining hall with her head held high, through the mansion that had once been a place she hoped to pass through unnoticed, and she thought, "This is enough. This is more than I once thought was possible." And the next morning she walked through it again. And that, in the end, was what recovery looked like. Not a single transforming moment, but the accumulation of mornings on which it became incrementally easier to believe that tomorrow was worth arriving for. Sometimes justice begins with one person who refuses to look away. Sometimes healing begins with one person who sees beyond the bruise to the strength beneath it. And sometimes the person who changes your life is not the one who fights your battles for you, but the one who quietly insists that your life has always been worth the fighting. The end.